Hello, I'm Geoff Shullenberger. Welcome back to Blame Theory, where we take a serious look at the ideas that have shaped our minds and our world to ask how have we ended up here, and whom or what can we blame. So I'm joined again by Ashley Frawley to talk about her favorite topic, again, eugenics.
Everything comes down to eugenics for me.
You,
It's like
yeah.
a caricature
So,
at this point. I try when I'm writing, I'm like, don't talk about eugenics. Don't talk about eugenics.
yeah, so eugenics, we discussed on the previous episode the origins of eugenics. We went over what I took to be the history of it as it's popularly understood as a phenomenon, and the idea that it was discredited. I noted that in the Wikipedia article, it begins by describing it as a mostly discredited um, enterprise, which I think the mostly is kind of interesting there. But basically, I went through what I took to be the standard history, and I'm going to do something, and then we sort of tried to poke some holes in that. So I'm going to do something similar now, which is I pointed out that in this sort of standard history, there's an idea that with the defeat of Nazism, there's a kind of discrediting of a lot of these ideas because you had a regime that put them so aggressively into practice. And obviously, there are all kinds of and so the idea that eugenics is discredited is often traced to the notion that, well, it couldn't really survive as a credible intellectual paradigm after the Nazis. Now, of course, as you've argued in many contexts, there are problems with this, especially when it comes to the revival of things like euthanasia in recent years. But without getting back into that quite yet, I wanted to give another kind of potted history that will go over some landmarks that might sort of suggest the opposite of my previous one, which is that on some level the paradigm never really went away and continued to kind of haunt the mainstream Western liberal imagination in various ways. So, as a somewhat arbitrary starting point, because I think there are several others you could take in the post-war era, I wanted to mention the 1976 book Sociobiology by the Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson, who was not a self-proclaimed eugenicist, would not have understood himself that way. He was somebody who studied, he was an expert on ants and social insects. And so he brought those studies to bear on thinking about human society. And in sociobiology, he attempted to introduce really a new paradigm. He saw it quite explicitly as a kind of paradigm shifting book. And he was somebody who also in a later book from the sociobiology came out in 76. I believe around 1995, he published a book called Consilience, which argues for the kind of unity of the humanities and the sciences, with, of course, the humanities essentially subjugated to the paradigms of the sciences. So he was somebody who essentially believed that biology had to extend its domain into the understanding of human society, human culture, etc. So he was of a piece with Richard Dawkins in the same period in that sense, who wrote The Selfish Gene, which I believe also came out in 1976. And so these two books made the argument for applying biological understandings of various phenomena, including genetics and heredity, to human society. So these books, again, were not, they were not framed as, they certainly would have avoided claiming the mantle of eugenics because of the disrepute in which it existed at the time. But nonetheless, they did resuscitate anxieties about eugenics and critiques of eugenics. And I'd specifically note here that fellow Harvard professors, Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould, both of whom were self-described Marxists, dedicate a good amount of effort to attempting to demolish both Wilson's sociobiology paradigm as well as the kind of emerging science of genetics in the 1970s and 80s, with Lewontin publishing a book, Not in Our Genes, in 1984.
Just to be clear, they weren't against genetics. It was the overextension of
Yes,
genetics.
that's right. They were not disputing the existence of of heredity, but they were
You never know those Marxists.
questioning. Yeah, true. But they were questioning its application in the work of figures like Wilson and Dawkins in this period. And so then, if we move into the 1990s, despite these critiques, we have the emergence of the Human Genome Project and a great deal of sort of optimism and hype around genetics, that the mapping of the human genome is just going to be this fundamental paradigm shift. I've seen people compare this recently to how people talk about AI today, that and this is usually brought up in such a way as to question some of the hype around AI by saying, well, everybody was making great prognostications about the profound impact of the Human Genome Project and the mapping of the human genome, but a lot of that didn't pan out, and so many people are saying, by extension, a lot of the AI promises are hype that's going to evaporate at some point. So that's been interesting to see. But the second sort of 1990s landmark that I would point to here is the infamous bell curve by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, which is it's a book that has a kind of odd reputation in afterlife because it really was given a great deal of mainstream attention, essentially positive attention, but it subsequently kind of fell into disrepute in certain ways. But it was a bestseller. It was the subject of positive reviews in many mainstream outlets, and then subsequently became seen as sort of problematic and untouchable. And so it became this kind of underground classic that, in fact, I remember seeing some, I don't know, third tier sort of right wing e-girl podcaster a few years ago with where she was doing a video and you could see her bookshelf in the back, and of course in a prominent place was the bell curve. So this kind of gives you a sense of how it continued to have this sort of afterlife as this sort of forbidden classic, which is somewhat ironic because it was actually quite positively received and taken very seriously when it was first released in, I believe, 1992. And so then the final thing I wanted to bring up, which ties into the e-girl podcaster, having the bell curve on her back shelf, is the reemergence of various forms of explicit. And again, I would say, certainly Wilson and Dawkins and figures like that. I would say to some extent Murray and Herrnstein too, even though they were much more willing to talk in terms of racial groups, and sort of openly revive that sort of science of racial classification that had been so taboo for a certain amount of time in the post-war era, that they still wouldn't have really positively claimed the mantle of eugenics. But sometime in the 2010s, with the emergence of the alt-right, you just see people positively saying, yes, eugenics is good. We support eugenics. Just openly talking about eugenic and dysgenic and things like this. And, these are mostly sort of anonymous posters and so on. But the culmination of this, I would say, is the publication of Costin Alamariu's Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy, which was his dissertation in a revised version, which he published, I believe, in mid-2023. And, Costin Alamariu is a Bronze Age pervert, probably the most prominent figure to come out of the sort of anon alt-right Twitter sphere of the 2010s. And in this book, he really argues that eugenics is the foundation of Western paradigms, on a very fundamental level, like that the entire philosophical project is built on eugenics, is essentially his argument. So it's a sort of robust defense of eugenics as foundational and inescapable for Western philosophy and science, and thus for Western civilization as a whole. So this is maybe the most, the most sophisticated, and although he's not known for, he's more known for being this kind of weird, eccentric guy who posts in this kind of caveman patois. But in this book, he, which was his dissertation at Yale, he presents a sophisticated and rigorous attempt to reestablish eugenics at the foundation of knowledge, really. And so that's quite an interesting document in that regard. And beyond that, I think we could say that many people in the tech world who have a certain sympathy with the online right ideology that emerged out of the 2010s are also increasingly willing to just kind of openly embrace talk of eugenics. And some of these are quite influential people. And so that's sort of the history that I would give of how, really that there has been a repeated resurgence of this set of themes, even as there still has been this attempt to kind of apply a taboo on it. There have nevertheless been sort of influential and prominent attempts to revive it, or to revive things that could be described as eugenics, or as at least adjacent to eugenics. And then, finally, I think we have an open and sort of confident reassertion of its value by this particular faction of the right that's been rising, and that, for reasons I might go into a bit later, has a particular centrality in the tech industry in Silicon Valley. So I'm curious, do you have anything to add to that, or further quibbles with how I characterized all of this?
No, I mean, it's been a long time since I've really gone through in detail a lot of these debates. They were extremely formative in my entire. You ever see these jokes that people, online joke about, like, oh, you suddenly become kind of self-aware when you're like 5 years old and you look around and the kids are all like, shoving blocks in their mouths and you're like, oh, what am I doing here? It's like that, this whole debate, that was like that for me. I remember going to my lecturer in like second year university and being like obviously sociobiology explains everything. Can you imagine? And I was like, this is so important. Like, why is this not more in our curriculum? And so I was like,
so you're saying you almost became a eugenicist, is what you're saying?
Yeah, because, and I've thought about that a lot. Why did I find it so convincing? And by a similar kind of token, I also one day sat procrastinating and in first year university, read my roommate's entire first year psychology textbook, a class that I was not taking at the time. Read it, absolutely fascinated. And I think about that all because I'm obviously quite critical of psychology now. But I loved it. And why? Why did I love that? Because these were just so stories. Everything is just so. And it was wonderful. It just explained everything in this neat, tidy little package. And then, so then I went all in on sociobiology. I thought it was really important. I wrote an essay about how important sociobiology is to understanding everything. And then as I'm writing this essay, I think I actually did hand that one in, and then I had to do another essay after that. And I start going in on the other side of the debate. And I read The Mismeasure of Man and blew my mind completely it became like so formative of who I am. Then I read Ken and Malick's The Meaning of Race, and that made me who I am today. I still like, I must have read that book 20 times, and since then I've read it even I it's like it is ingrained in my entire in my heart. Like it's like tattooed on my brain. So these were extremely important debates for me. Um and I I've been increasingly discouraged by the fact that there doesn't seem to be a Stephen Jay Gould again around. And I've wanted a few times to revisit some of these debates and put them into this sort of present context where we are now, because kind of what happened was this sociobiological perspective, or this, quasi-eugenic perspective came to, or like, the bell curve, the arguments that are made in the bell curve became, as you say, untouchable. And then because of that, those who do read it, like I did, feel like, ooh, this is like secret information, and then it becomes based. And then, but then nobody's willing to touch it. Nobody's willing to give it, the legitimacy by arguing against it. And then it kind of flourishes. And there just isn't anybody with the courage of their convictions to write a book like The Mismeasure of Man again, which was also like it was written for, I don't know how old I was when this all happened. Maybe I was like 19 years old or something. And dumb as hell, obviously. And I read it, and it connected with me. It was so wonderfully well explained and written for a popular audience. Like, there are very few of these kinds of books around anymore. But the thing is also, I think that outlook, and we touched on this last time, is also really prevalent on the left. And that's what people don't want to admit. And I suspect is possibly why people are evading so many debates and arguments, because they're afraid of what they might see in themselves. Just to give an example of this, I was on GB News a while back with one of those like abolish the family types. It wasn't Sophie Lewis, it was somebody else. And she said, I think the people who need to be having kids are the people who really, really want kids and will be damn good parents, you know? And that's very common. People say that all the time. Like you see internet threads all the time about, anytime you talk about like disciplining children, you have all these threads of people being like, well, your kids are going to cut you off when they're older and you'll deserve it. And then when kids are undisciplined, it's like, where are the parents? Why aren't they disciplining their children? And it's like always blaming parents anytime there's a problem. And this is all over the left as well. All over the left. I get death threats all the time, but like I got one of the issues for which I received a huge amount of death threats was on the whole smacking debate. And I was like, this just isn't the business of the state. You don't want to be arresting people because of how they choose to discipline their children. We're talking about like light smacks on the back of the hand or the butt or something like that. This is not like beating children, which is already illegal, obviously. But what is the underlying kind of thrust of that? It was like, you are damaging children. You are creating trauma. You're creating this intergenerational trauma, if you want to bring it into indigenous people. And so there is this very, very pervasive and deep kind of discourse about damage that functions in the exact same way. And it's talking about parents, and it's ostensibly social because it has something to do with people doing things. But it is the same kind of idea that there is some kind of inborn affliction that makes these people unable to thrive in the world. Right. So it's the same kind of logic. It's just like, instead of, and sometimes it does go deeper. Like, it's like, oh, that didn't work. Well, let's like make sure, let's control pregnant women harder, make sure that, no, they even put like warning labels on alcohol that no woman capable of becoming pregnant should drink alcohol. Like no woman capable of becoming pregnant should drink alcohol. That's it. It's banned from you guys. Because it's like, well, we have to go into the womb and we have to kind of make sure that the woman is saying the right things in the womb. And all of this has this facade, this veneer of it being social, because it's, I don't know, people think that social is behavior, because at least it's not full on eugenics. It's not full on genetics, but it's the exact same thing. It's like you are born with a mark and you bear this mark throughout your life. And that there's something inborn that is the reason why we have social problems. It's the exact same kind of logic. And it is what I was going with that story about the woman on GB News. What she was implying there is that the wrong people are breeding. When she says the only people who should be having children are the ones who will be excellent parents, she has a particular idea in her mind what the excellent parent is, and it's not the majority of people. And the wrong people are breeding. The right people should be having children, which implies that the wrong people are having children. It's a very sort of eugenic argument. And so last time we talked about how I understand that, which is that this is a kind of social pathology perspective. If you want to know what that is, you can go back and listen to that previous episode. But I think that is pervasive now because of the collapse of the left, that all we have now are these essentially right-wing arguments about an inborn incapacity within the individual. And it gets dressed up in all sorts of different ways. It gets dressed up in, like, I talked about this in an article for Compact about, this critical race theorist who said the reason why Black people don't do as well in school is because they suffer from, and she gives this long list, and one of them was cognitive impairments. So she's like, because they have, social, cognitive, blah, 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 impairments that are due to the legacy of racism and slavery in America. Okay, you just said that Black people don't do as well because they're cognitively impaired. Now, your rationale sounds nice, but it's the exact same argument that Herrnstein and Murray were making in the bell curve. That's what they were saying. They were saying the person sitting next to you has an IQ of like 70, I've mangled this. This is Stephen Jay Gould said there's a 30, does that sound believable to you that there's a 33% chance that the Black person sitting next to you is retarded? That's how he made fun of, like, he's like, obviously there's something wrong with your measurement when that's the, like, result that you're going to get. But that's the same kind of argument that they are making here, except they are saying it through this, like, instead of saying retarded, they're saying cognitively impaired. And I once sat through a lecture at Kent, I remember years ago, where it was the same kind of thing. They're doing all these studies in prisons, and they're like, we have found an astonishing number of people in prisons with learning difficulties, which is the nice way of saying what they used to say, retarded. And it's like, and what Gould does a wonderful job of pointing out is there's something wrong. You're measuring something with these things, but you're measuring more your tool. There's not high validity there. Like, we know when we're talking to prisoners, they're not literally retarded. There's something wrong with your tests. But I don't know. You know what? I feel like I say that to you, and you, I don't know, educated person would say, yeah, of course. But I honestly think, like, on Twitter or something, the based right winger would be like, yeah, they are, and that explains everything. So it is absolutely pervasive. You just get a different wash. You get a different flavor.
So it might be worth revisiting an aspect of Gould's critique, which comes out of his Marxist, and I believe Lewontin as well, his sort of Marxist theoretical background, which is the concept of reification. So as I recall, again, it's been a while since I've read these arguments in depth.
That's why I want to write about it. I want to revisit all this.
So reification is, essentially treating a sort of abstraction as a thing, and that, as I recall, is a large part of how they critique ideas about IQ, for example. So is that a decent characterization that essentially they're, if we wanted to boil it down, it's that what IQ is some sort of artifact of some broader set of social relations, and in a particular time and place. And what IQ sort of science or pseudoscience does is, simply take that as a simple fact of nature that is simply inalterable, given, and has nothing to do with it is not, it has no social cause. It's simply a sort of natural fact, like gravity.
I can't remember the exact, like, how reification fits into this. But yes, you're sort of like you are taking this Yeah, let me just go back to some of the things that they more concretely sort of that Gould more concretely criticizes the bell curve for, because it was published in 1981 and then republished in 96 with a couple of chapters added on about the bell curve, and that was the bit that I remember being really really convincing. And one of the things is that if IQ is just this like static thing, why is it that as countries get richer, the average IQ gets higher? You know, and it becomes quite clear that it's a social artifact. You're measuring like the people who created it, who think that this particular thing is useful. You're measuring the degree to which the person will not give up on the question, which is not, Gould doesn't say that, but that's just one of the things that people suggest is one of the issues, is that a lot of people will give up and a lot of people will carry on. And then, there's other experiments people use that also kind of essentialize these what are essentially social traits, which is like the marshmallow test. So if you wait and you don't eat the marshmallow, then you can, that shows that, that's an indicator that you're going to grow up and you're going to be successful. But the thing is, like, if you come from a background in which nothing good comes if you wait, you better eat that damn marshmallow now. Or else you're not going to get any marshmallows later. So, and it's like, and that's not something that is easily measurable with something like a postcode, where people will be like, oh, it doesn't matter. We controlled for postcodes and socioeconomic things. You simply can't. Society is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly complex. It's really not possible to control for all the different factors that you would need to control for in order to say that IQ truly is the cause, or that IQ truly is measuring some kind of innate intelligence. Now, I don't doubt that there is some kind of innate intelligence. I mean, like, some people are, tall, some people are short. That's going to make you better at basketball, or, whatever short people are good at. It's, I don't doubt that there are some differences, but in terms of like big racial differences or group-based differences, or differences that go, beyond a clear kind of deficit in like an illness that we would call an illness, that would actually mean that you could never progress beyond a certain point. I don't think so, because how could you possibly, all human beings are born into society. Everybody is born into society. It's not possible to measure somebody outside of society. And like, and what is society is so many factors. Like, you could take two identical, this is a point that Ian Hacking makes, like, you can take two identical pieces of paper and put them into a machine and rip them in an identical way. And when you look at those pieces of paper under a microscope, there will be tiny, tiny little differences between the two pieces of paper, even though you had like controlled conditions and so on, because there's just so many different factors that go into making a piece of paper, making an object like that. And imagine for a human, how many, you are a conglomeration of so many different aspects and interactions, and your position in society and the position, it is just so complex to say that you could sort of measure something like that and pull it out as a causal factor in a huge range of social problems, as opposed to like an indicator of something, some kind of deprivation, some kind of whatever. It just doesn't wash. But because we haven't really, and even I haven't like sat down and said, okay, let's really try to do this. Let's really put this to bed, at least publicly. Making that argument feels really edgy. It feels quite avant-garde.
So just kind of going back to the bell curve, it's worth, and you could say this about sociobiology too, but I think the bell curve is the easier one to make this case for, because it's quite explicit in a way, at least in the American context, although there's analogous developments everywhere. You have the attempt culminating in the Great Society programs of the 1960s, the LBJ administration, to really expand social welfare, to engage in a so-called war on poverty, to kind of bring, various urban and rural, poor communities kind of out of backwardness, and improve infrastructure, improve education, and create opportunity. And so this is the sort of twilight of the great sort of liberal projects of social improvement. And then, I'm giving a very schematic history here, but then the welfare state kind of enters into crisis, partly due to the massive military expenditures in Vietnam, but also due to the perceived failures of a lot of these efforts and the worsening sort of urban blight in many parts of the US in the 1970s. And so, gradually you have just a broader kind of shift in a sort of political and moral paradigm. And so the bell curve is part of why it's so significant, even though, again, it becomes this kind of underground, becomes perceived as this kind of underground classic of sort of dissident literature. It's really, in many ways, kind of aligned with a broader policy shift that is manifested in things like Bill Clinton's welfare reform efforts and his, basically kind of rapprochement with the austerity-driven Republican Party. And basically, the reason the bell curve is significant here is because it's if you boil it down, it's saying, well, people just have these innate attributes and properties, and if the government just tries to aggressively intervene to re-engineer society to get rid of those inherent natural differences, then it's just going to again, they wouldn't necessarily use this exact language, but it's essentially this argument about a sort of dysgenic policy that, it's just going to cause, going back to your point before, like the wrong kind of people to propagate themselves. And it's going to incentivize. And this is why the sort of stuff about welfare moms and tying welfare to work requirements, there was sort of this idea that welfare incentivized people to pump out children, which meant that the state was burdened with the support of these people who would never really contribute productively to society. And then the other thing that's important about the bell curve in the moment in which it appears is that it's tied into ideas about the information economy or the knowledge economy. And you saw really a broad array of pundits and analysts from the right to the left in various ways, really kind of celebrating this shift. Ironically now, because we're now, under this administration that's like, we need to bring back factories. Well, back then it was kind of the opposite. It was like, well, the smokestack economy is over, as they called it, which means, we'll get to do much more sophisticated things. We'll have a much more complex division of labor, and the rewards will accrue to people who are highly educated because the real commodity is now information or knowledge. And this is a key part of the bell curve because Herrnstein and Murray also observe that the nature of the economy is shifting to one in which greater and greater rewards will accrue to those with higher IQs or higher sort of intellectual endowments who are able to operate in this shifting realm of information, of kind of globalized information networks and knowledge exchange. And so if there's a lot of commentary in this period about how the sort of institutions of American government are trapped in this old paradigm where which coincided with the sort of industrial era, and now that we're entering a post-industrial economy, we need to update our institutions and governmental structures in response to that. And so the bell curve is really part of that, and it's saying part of what it's saying is we particularly can't have a welfare state which is already obsolete because it belongs to a different moment of the high industrial era, and so it's obsolete. in that sense, but it also is going to burden society with these people who can't contribute to the new economy and who can't be part of the cutting edge of innovation in this new under this new paradigm. And it's interesting that if you look at the work of the economist Robert Reich, who's kind of considered like one of the leftmost figures in the Clinton administration in this period, he's also making very much the same arguments. I mean, not the kind of we need to cut off welfare so we don't have these useless eaters sucking up public resources. Like, he's not saying that, but he is saying, his influential term is symbolic analysts, that the real vanguard of the future are the symbolic analysts. In other words, people who work in the knowledge economy and manipulate symbols, and the rewards of the new economic paradigm will accrue to those people. And so there really is this kind of sense that everybody is making versions of this argument, really. And obviously it's partly because there is something happening. The economy is deindustrializing. The growth areas are these areas tied to IT. And so, it's not disconnected, but it's interesting that the way that it's framed is very much around, there are certain people who will just be kind of naturally rewarded by the returns of this new economic order. And so then the people who are not part of that are naturally a problem that society has to figure out how to deal with. And so if you're kind of more on the left of that, you're, Robert Reich or somebody like that, in fact, what happens is a lot of people, this is when I think the Democratic Party gets really obsessed with education reform, because the idea is, well, okay, we can't just kind of give these people welfare forever, but we can educate them. And so we can improve educational opportunities. And so that becomes the panacea that I'd say the kind of left flank of the mainstream establishment embraces. And what's interesting there is that it in effect is premised on the idea that what you need to do is kind of go into these communities and using and this brings us back to IQ and various other things, using various tools of educational measurement, sort of identify the talented people from these poorer sectors of society and allow them to have opportunity, through affirmative action, through various kinds of recruitment programs. And then this will, allow them to advance to the top and thus, supposedly somehow kind of lift up their communities with them. And so that, interestingly, is kind of the left flank of, people who might be horrified by the bell curve with its kind of laissez-faire social Darwinist, return to a kind of laissez-faire social Darwinist approach where it's like, well, that there are people who are just not particularly productive, not particularly able to contribute to society. That's even more the case now that we have an information economy. And so we just kind of need to not waste resources on trying to, to keep these people fed. We just need to kind of cut them off and let nature take its course. And so that's the brutal version. But then the progressive version is, well, we need to, in effect, kind of identify the talented, in these sectors of society, pluck them out and allow them to rise to the top. And then somehow that will sort of trickle down to everybody else. And that, to my mind, really is and I recommend a book that I think was, I have some quibbles with it. I reviewed it partially favorably, partially critically at the time, but Freddie de Boer's The Cult of Smart, which is sort of a critique of what he calls the education gospel, I believe, which is kind of this project of social uplift through education, which, as he points out, is just on some level quite absurd as a kind of broad-based universalist if it's framed as a broad-based universalist progressive program, because the entire point of education is it is structured around these kind of competitive processes. And so the idea that it could ever be designed to kind of uplift everyone or provide broad-based improvement is just a fundamental category mistake. But nonetheless, that was really kind of the driving force of, again, what was sort of ostensibly the progressive alternative to the bell curve view. But and this kind of goes back to your points. I think in many ways was not particularly distinguishable from it, and proceeded from many of the same premises.
Yeah, I mean, you had at the same time, Hillary Clinton's whole initiative the first 3 years, and it takes a village and all that stuff, which was a very, very similar kind of idea of they basically agreed, but instead of saying, well, this is just like an innate thing, they were like, no, we can go in and we can change it. I mean, but like they still agreed with their fundamental understanding of why things go wrong, that there was something amiss within the individual. That's just, and this is because of the famous line that Thatcher said of that her greatest accomplishment or whatever was Tony Blair. The greatest outcome of that 1980s neoliberalism was 1990s, well, the 1990s collapse of liberalism, into this absolute acceptance of all of these premises. And really, and you talked about this a little bit in past tense, but I think that was the same logic of a lot of the DEI stuff. It's like, well, we go into these communities and we'll like uplift people of different colors and then that will do it. And I remember debating this, did a public debate once, and the person saying this, I was like, okay, well, like, what's the end game? So like a more colorful distribution within the existing class structure. There's You're not doing anything to that class structure because we've all just agreed we can't do anything about that. So we would just have a distribution, but also like a more favorable distribution of like different groups, better representation of whites in the working class. Fantastic. For more whites in the underclass. That's what we want. Hurrah. I can get on board with that. I mean, it's just that was the extent of it. This was the sort of low expectations that, well, these are the low expectations that have populated our political discussions for decades now. But it gets scarier. It gets scarier because, as you say, you start getting to this kind of useless eaters territory. Because what winds up happening is you get an increase as these interventions don't work. Because, like, what would it even mean for it to work? You're still going to have all kinds of social problems in the underclass because you still have an underclass. It's just the composition of the underclass might slightly change. And so you have all these interventions, right? You're paying all this money. Oh, I'm going to fund my program to do this, and I'm going to intervene for young mothers and blah, 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 or like working class mothers, and I'm going to solve X problem. And the problem doesn't go away. Or actually, interestingly, the teenage pregnancy problem did go away, and it was replaced by a falling birth rate. You scared everybody out of having kids at all. Again,
Yeah,
because they
that's
were.
right. I always think about this with like the conservatives of the 90s, that in my sort of first conscious memory, they were all just concerned about, too many babies being born. And now it's switched to the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah, because they were what they were always doing with that was the same kind of logic, right? You have before teenage pregnancy was a social problem, it was the unwed mother. And the reason why it was the unwed mother was because the age at which a woman had her children during that time, which was much younger. Um, and so they couldn't blame the age of the woman. It had to be her morals. It was her morals that she wasn't married. That was the problem. Then it became the age that a woman has her children. But anyways, we're all quite certain that it is the woman's fault that she simply produces the wrong kind of offspring. And if we could get the right kind of women to produce the right kind of offspring, then we will have a nation of, it's a very eugenic kind of, only healthy seed will be sown. Is that healthy? What's that propaganda poster that everybody always uses? Anyway, but it's that exact same kind of logic. But what I was getting at there is that you have all of these interventions and they don't do anything about the problems that you claim to be able to solve. And people don't say like, oh, I've misunderstood the problem. They just get more pessimistic. And I've said this a couple of times, but it's worth repeating here. They become more and more pessimistic, and they kind of shift over more and more to that view that there must be something innate. Like, I tried to fix you, and you still keep making the wrong choices. You still keep doing the wrong things. You remain a burden. it must be something about you. And so it starts to shift into this awful kind of anti-human territory, and you will just continue to you will have a growing underclass of people that need to be kept alive, that are not useful. And of course, the underlying logic is that there's obviously being part of the underclass has a number of corrosive effects on a human being. And that's what often people are measuring when they're saying, see, look, the underclass. I mean, as I think I gave the example of musical chairs last time, like you can do all the studies you want to find out like why those are the ones who get left out. And yeah, you will get an accumulation of the worst in society at the bottom, but that's not why you're necessarily there. It's not that you had something horrible inside of you. It's first of all, that's what happens in the underclass. You wind up having all sorts of different ways of doing things because it works for you. You know, you have toxic masculinity and all this stuff. Because if you're effeminate, you get the shit kicked out of you. You know, so like you have all of that stuff that goes on. It becomes like a very dog eat dog kind of world. This is the world that I remember growing up in. You know, you show weakness, people will eat you alive, and people would like steal all the time. You know, like, oh, you couldn't keep anything. So like you get shoes stolen right off your feet, right off your feet. Like my clothes get stolen right out of my closet. CD's gone, everything's gone all the time. And that's just that kind of world. Like if you show any kind of weakness, I was a little too bookish to belong in that world. I was weak for sure, and I was an easy target. So I had stuff stolen from me all the time. Anyways, and that's what that world is. But that's not the cause of why people wind up being there. So you end up, you do all these studies, you find out, oh my goodness, look at the characteristics of the underclass. They're all these horrible people and they have all these bad habits and da 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 da. And you're like, see, that's why they're there. But no, you have this class system that spits people out. And yeah, it might be your choices that led you there, but somebody making some other choice is going to wind up there, and they will deal with all the horror that comes with it. And well, we live in the age of no alternative. So what do we do about that? What do we do about that? Well, we get pieces in the New Statesman talking about old people, but let them die. Let them die. You know, that's the logic. If there is no alternative, well, we have all these old people, they're useless eaters, let them die. We're going in that direction. I finished the last podcast, the flagship weekly podcast, by saying, like, what are we so afraid of? You know, no alternative was because we looked at the horrors of the 20th century and we went, oh my God, look, we had industrialized killing, like we had authoritarianism, we had the loss of freedoms. We'll never try that again. Liberal capitalism is the best thing we've got because we're not going to do that. We're doing that. We're making these arguments. It's based to do so. What are we so afraid of? Like, we're going to have to start thinking, like, what are we even doing this for? What is the point of everything? There's this famous fascist line where one of these fascists said something like, they will build the roads, but the working men will build the roads, but they'll drive over them only in trucks and tanks. You know, you'll build the world, but you dare enjoy it. What are we doing this for, if not for the longevity and the comfort of the human being? We could do that. Could we start having a conversation about that? You know, that's why I like commissioning Ted Reese for the magazine, because I feel like he's one of the very few people. I find these people out there in the world. I'm like, yes, you are trying to think about what that might look like. And it sounds fringe and crazy, but we should maybe entertain the idea, because I think it sounds fringe and crazy to say that most of the human population is just useless. And like, we should just let old people die because they watch daytime television. Sorry, I know that's from the New Statesman. If you want to know what I'm talking about, go and read the New Statesman article that came out a couple of days ago.
Well, if we follow the AI discourse, in fact, perhaps all of the human population is useless.
Yes, right?
Seems to be the you know, this is your piece on a world without people, sort of touching back on that. But you know, this is really I wanted to bring up one figure who's kind of interesting here, which is William Shockley, who was one of the developers of the transistor and thus a kind of major founding figure of Silicon Valley. And, you know, was a professor at Stanford, a very, you know, prominent figure. But in his later years, he really became a hardcore eugenicist. You know, he openly talked about eugenic and dysgenic terminology, and he wasn't, he was much less coy about it than others. And he had tenure at Stanford, so he could just get away with this. But so there is something interesting about that there's some sort of logic there that you're developing uh, this technology that's seen as a kind of ideal form of human intelligence, which is how really from the origins computation is conceived of in part this way, as sort of abstracting the logical core of human intelligence and removing it from the human brain and just allowing it to kind of work itself out in this idealized form. And so it's perhaps not surprising that somebody who's deeply involved in that project would become a kind of prominent advocate of reviving the old discourse of eugenics. I believe he ran for Senate in California on an explicitly eugenic platform in like 1980. So he wasn't shy about this. So Shockley is kind of an interesting figure here because on some level that you can really see that through line. And I mean, I guess what's kind of interesting today is like a lot of these people, the sort of Sam Altman and other type people, it's like, well, if you don't bring up the race aspect of it, you can just sort of get away with saying like, well, the whole human population is just this kind of inferior race that needs to be replaced by some
Literally,
superior race. And as long as you just don't put that in racial terms, as long as you just say, oh, the machines are better than us and are going to take over, then you can just get away with it and not be considered problematic at all, which is sort of interesting. It's only when you actually bring in the racial version of it, where it's like, well, there's you can have the same ideas about AI acceleration, but then if you also say, well, like East Asians and whites are better suited to future integration with AGI, and then like that still gets you in trouble. But although maybe less and less so because of the current administration, a lot of those people would be fine with that. But
well, they wouldn't say it because
but you can just be a complete. I mean, it's your misanthropology again, but like it's just kind of amazing to me that you can be a sort of hardcore eugenicist in the sense of just thinking, well, humanity as a whole is just this kind of sub race of useless eaters that needs to just kind of be done away with and replaced with this machinic master race. It's just very bizarre that was a completely acceptable position, and it's kind of treated as like, oh, it's kind of cute and eccentric that they think this stuff. But it's very odd to me that sort of seems like partly the way this entire ideology just gets revived in a new form is through the AI discourse.
Yeah, I mean, boy, in that whole like race thing, you can just really see, and I see in my mind like an image so clearly of just humanity reaching over and over and failing to grasp, because you just have this like reaching for the future and failing to grasp it and being like, oh, I guess this is just it then. So they're like, well, I guess this is just it then for me, white man, right? So this is just it because you are lesser than I am. I am meant to be here because I'm better and I'm closer to God, and you are closer to nature. You're more like an animal, women, Black people, and so on. And then it's like we progress beyond that. We have this opportunity to progress beyond that. We recognize, we're all equal. There's a human essence among us. And it's like, yeah, we're reaching. And it's like, and the essence is we're all stupid. We're all irrational. We're all close to nature. We're all just animals. It was just like, instead of bringing everybody up to God, we threw everybody down into the dirt. Like we were supposed to go the opposite direction. And we just reached, couldn't get there. And down we went again. Ugh.